Augusta Maddox had turned down 4 men in 3 years, and the fifth one her father dragged through the door on a Tuesday afternoon was not going to be any different. The year was 1878, and the territory of New Mexico burned under a late summer sun that had no mercy for anyone who stood beneath it too long. The town of Redemption Creek sat at the edge of a wide, red-bluffed canyon, a place where the wind came off the mesa every evening smelling of sage and dry heat, where the saloon stayed busy 6 nights a week, and where everyone knew everyone else's name, their livestock count, and most of their private business before breakfast. It was a hard land, honest in its cruelty, and the people who stayed in it did so because they had decided, somewhere deep down, that hardness was something they could live with. Clarence Maddox had decided that a very long time ago. He had come out to New Mexico territory as a young man with a horse, a rifle, and $40 sewn into the lining of his boot, and he had built the Broken Spur Ranch from nothing but those modest beginnings and a stubbornness that bordered on a spiritual calling. By the time Augusta was born, the ranch had 300 head of cattle, a bunkhouse that slept 8 hands, and a main house with a proper parlor and glass windows. By the time she was grown, the Broken Spur was the biggest spread within 50 miles, and Clarence Maddox was the kind of man other men stood up a little straighter around. He was not a cruel father. That needed to be said plainly and understood. He was a man who loved his daughter the way a man of his generation loved things he valued most, which was to say he was not often soft about it, but the love was there, solid and real, underneath all his practical decisions. His wife, Eleanor, had died of fever when Augusta was 11, and the grief of that loss had made Clarence both more protective of his daughter and more single-minded about her future. He wanted her settled. He wanted her secure. He wanted to know that when his own time came, which he thought about more and more as the years pressed on him, Augusta would not be left alone in this unforgiving country. Augusta understood all of this. She understood it thoroughly, the way you understand a map of country you have ridden yourself. But understanding a thing and agreeing to be shaped by it were two entirely different matters, and Augusta Maddox had never been a woman who let even love, even her father's love, do the shaping for her. She was 22 years old that summer. Tall for a woman of her time, with dark auburn hair she wore braided or pinned up when the work required it, and loose around her shoulders in the evenings when the house was quiet. She had her mother's dark eyes and her father's jaw, which was to say she had a face that was striking rather than pretty in the soft, expected way, and a look about her that made strangers pay attention and neighbors choose their words with care. She could ride anything in the corral. She read every book and newspaper she could get her hands on. She had opinions about ranching, about the land treaties that were shredding the territory apart, about water rights and the railroad's slow, inevitable crawl westward, and she did not hold those opinions back when she had something worth saying. The first man her father had brought to her was Thomas Whitfield, a cattleman from Socorro with a ranch twice the size of the Broken Spur, and a manner Augusta described, privately to herself, as being similar to a man who had always been handed things, and therefore believed everything was owed to him. He was 35. Augusta was 19. He had looked her over the way a man looks over a horse at auction, and she had looked right back at him with eyes that made him clear his throat and study the ceiling. When he left that evening, she told her father plainly that she would not marry Thomas Whitfield if the alternative was riding alone into the desert with nothing but a canteen. The second man was Gerald Hume, who was at least kind, she would give him that. But Gerald Hume had the conversational range of a fence post, and after 2 suppers during which she had carried the entire weight of any exchange that could be called a conversation, she had told her father that kindness alone did not make a marriage, and she would be needing a man who had something to say. The third was a banker named Elias Pryor who came from Santa Fe and spoke to her like she was a transaction. She had not even let it reach a second meeting. The fourth, and this one had genuinely surprised her in a complicated way, was a younger man, a rancher's son named Henry Slade, who was actually handsome and not entirely unpleasant. But there was something in the way he deferred entirely to her father, never once looking at her when he spoke as though she were a person whose thoughts mattered, that made something inside Augusta go very quiet and very cold. She needed a man who saw her. Not the broken spur, not Clarence Maddox's approval, not the acres and the cattle and the house with the glass windows. Her. And so when the fifth man, a land speculator named Douglas far from Albuquerque, arrived on that Tuesday with his polished boots and his too-wide smile, Augusta stood in the doorway of the parlor, looked at him once, and felt nothing but the familiar, bone-deep certainty that this was not her life to be lived. She was polite to Douglas Farr. She was always polite. She offered him coffee, she answered his questions about the ranch with intelligence and brevity, and she watched his eyes slide past her to her father whenever anything important was said, as though she were a piece of furniture that had happened to speak. When he left, she did not wait for her father to raise the subject. "No," she said. Clarence Maddox set down his coffee cup. He looked at his daughter for a long moment. Outside, the evening wind was starting up off the mesa, and the curtains in the open window moved. "Augusta," he said, and there was something in his voice that was not anger exactly, but the tired edge of a man who has run out of easy patience. "You cannot refuse every man that comes through that door." "I have not refused every man," she said. "I have refused the men you have chosen. There is a difference, is there? There is a significant difference, yes." He stood up and walked to the window and looked out at the last of the daylight spreading copper and amber over the corral fence and the distant bluffs. She could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he carried the weight of his worries, and she felt the familiar pull of wanting to make things easy for him and the equally familiar refusal to do it at her own expense. "I want you taken care of," he said quietly. "That is all this is. I want to know you are not alone." "I know that," she said, "and I am not ungrateful for it. But being taken care of by the wrong man is not being taken care of. It is just a different kind of alone." He turned and looked at her, and she could see that she had said something that reached him, even if he was not ready to say so. "Then tell me," he said, and there was something raw in it. "Tell me what you are looking for, Augusta, because I have been trying." She was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the curtains again, and the light was going golden and long across the floorboards. "I will know it when I see it," she said. "I am sorry that is not a more useful answer, but it is the only honest one I have." He made a sound that was half a sigh and half something else, and he sat back down, and they did not speak of Douglas Farr again that evening. What Augusta had not told her father, because she was not entirely sure how to say it without it sounding like a criticism of the town and the life she actually loved, was that she had been watching someone for 3 weeks. Not in the manner of a woman who has decided to set her cap at someone, nothing so deliberate as that. More the way you watch a hawk circling over the mesa, because there is something about the movement that holds your attention without you having quite decided to give it. The man's name was Paul Hartwell. He had come to Redemption Creek in July, and he had come the way a lot of men came through these small territory towns, which was to say quietly, with a bedroll and a horse and not much explanation. He was a working cowhand, that was clear enough, and he had hired on with the neighboring ranch, the Callaway Spread, within a week of arriving. He was good at his work. She could see that from a distance, the way a person with a practiced eye can see competence in another person's handling of animals and land. He rode well, he worked steady, and he never seemed to be the sort of man who needed to make noise to prove he was in the room. He was 27 or 28, she judged, lean and sun-darkened, with a face that had been shaped by outdoor living into something quiet and steady. He had good hands. She had noticed that particularly, the hands of a man who worked with them and treated what he worked on with care. He wore a battered hat that had been expensive once and now was simply honest, and he had a way of looking at things, at the land, at the animals, at the people in a conversation, that made Augusta feel like he was actually seeing what was in front of him rather than looking past it for something else. She had spoken to him exactly twice before the story that mattered began. The first time was in Harlan's general store, when they had reached for the same shelf at nearly the same moment, and he had stepped back with an immediate courtesy that had nothing performed or exaggerated about it, simply a natural yielding of space, and said, "After you." She had taken the tin of coffee and thanked him, and he had nodded once, and that had been all. The second time was at the edge of the road past the livery stable, when she had been riding back from the east pasture, and he had been coming the other way on his own horse, a good red roan, and they had both stopped naturally because the road was narrow there and the moment called for it. He had touched his hat brim, and she had said good afternoon, and he had said it back. And then she had said something about the weather changing, which was true. There had been clouds building over the mountains all day, and he had looked up at those clouds and said, "Looks like it might be a real storm. You should probably get in before it breaks." Not as though he were telling her what to do, more like a man sharing a genuine observation with someone he assumed had the sense to use it. She had smiled, which surprised her slightly, and ridden on. Those two encounters, 5 words and a brief exchange about weather, were the sum total of what she actually knew about Paul Hartwell. But she had watched him at the town dances she attended with her father, watched him from across the room with the careful attention she gave to things that interested her, and she had noticed that he danced when asked but never pushed, that he laughed at the right moments and was quiet at others, that he bought a round for the men he worked with but did not drink to excess himself, and that he listened when people talked to him with the kind of focused stillness that suggested he was actually taking in what they said. She had not told herself it was anything. She was too careful for that. But she had thought about him more than she thought about the land speculator from Albuquerque. The storm that had been building all that afternoon broke the next day with a violence that the territory did not apologize for. By mid-morning, lightning was cracking across the canyon walls and rain was hammering the town of Redemption Creek, so hard the street became a river of red mud, and the sensible people were all inside watching the drama of it through their windows or their door frames. Augusta was not inside. Augusta was in the north pasture of the Broken Spur, because at first light she had ridden out to check on a mare in the remuda that had been favoring her left foreleg, and then the sky had come down before she could make it back to the barn. She had been riding hard for the ranch when she heard it, a sound over the rain that should not have been there, a high, thin sound that her horse also heard, the ears going forward and the stride shortening. She pulled up and listened, and there it was again. Not a person, an animal. She turned toward the sound without allowing herself too much thought about it, which was exactly the kind of decision that drove her father to distraction and that she could not seem to help making. The calf was in the drainage ditch that ran along the property line, a gully that was now running a foot of fast brown water, and the animal had gone in somehow and could not get out because the sides were too steep and too slick with the wet clay. It was a young calf, 3 or 4 months, and it was exhausted and frightened and making that thin, ongoing sound of an animal that has given over to fear. Augusta was off her horse before she had finished deciding to dismount. She slid down into the ditch in the mud and got her hands under the calf's haunches and pushed, and the animal scrambled, and she lost her footing and went down on one knee in the rushing water, and she got up and pushed again, and the calf made it halfway up and then slid back, and she was about to try a third time when she heard hoofbeats on the wet grass above her and a voice said, "Hold on." She looked up. Through the rain, Paul Hartwell was already off his horse and down on one knee at the edge of the ditch, reaching both hands down to her. "Lift the calf toward me," he said. "I have got the calf." She looked at him for a fraction of a second, rain running down both their faces, and something in the directness of him made her simply do it. She got underneath the calf and pushed upward with everything she had, and he caught it under the forelegs and pulled, and the animal came scrambling up out of the ditch and onto the bank, where it stood shaking and bawling. Then he reached down again for her. She took his hand and he pulled her up, and she came out of the ditch in a single, ungraceful lurch, landing on the bank beside him with mud on her riding skirt up to the waist and her braid plastered to her neck. She was breathing hard. He was breathing hard. The rain was still hammering them both. "Thank you," she said. It came out more direct than she expected because she had nothing left for ceremony after the ditch and the calf in the rain. "Is it one of yours?" he asked, looking at the calf which had stopped bawling and was now standing with its legs planted wide and its eyes wild and white. "Yes, it belongs to the Broken Spur herd. I will take it back." She paused. "Are you on your way somewhere I have pulled you from?" "I was riding fence line for Callaway," he said. "This is going to need to wait for the storm to let up anyway." He glanced at her then, a quick, direct look. "You should get out of this rain." "So should you," she said. He smiled, which changed his face in a way she found she wanted to look at. Not a large smile, just a quiet turn at the corners of his mouth that said he found the situation honestly amusing. "Yes," he said. "So should I." She got back onto her horse, and with some patient maneuvering they got the calf moving in the right direction, and she rode it back toward the Broken Spur with Paul Hartwell riding alongside her through the rain. They did not speak much because the storm was loud and riding took attention, but she was acutely aware of him beside her, the easy way he handled his roan in the difficult footing, the lack of any imposition in his presence, as though he were simply there and that was all the reason he needed. When they reached the gate of the Broken Spur, she turned to him. "Come in and get dry," she said. "I am not sending you back out in this." He hesitated, and she could see him weighing it, the etiquette of it, the correctness or otherwise of a man going into a young woman's house when her father was, as it happened, in town this morning and not yet back. "My father will not mind," she said. "He will be glad of the help with the calf, and the ranch hands are in the bunkhouse. You will not be alone." Something in her tone, which had not been an invitation exactly so much as a matter-of-fact statement of the obvious hospitality that this country had always run on, seemed to settle the question for him. "I appreciate it," he said. They got the calf into a stall in the barn, dried it down, checked its legs, and determined it was unhurt beyond being frightened and wet. Hector, one of the older ranch hands who had been with the Broken Spur for a decade, came out of the bunkhouse with a blanket for the calf and took over its management with the phlegmatic efficiency of a man who had seen worse. Augusta brought Paul Hartwell into the kitchen, which was the sensible room to bring a soaking wet person into because it was warm and practical, and there was coffee on the stove. She poured 2 cups without asking, and he took his, and sat down at the table with a naturalness that was comfortable without being presumptuous, as though he were at ease in any space he happened to occupy, but was careful not to take more of it than he had been offered. She changed into dry clothes, which took 10 minutes, and came back to find him still there, both hands around his coffee cup, looking out the kitchen window at the rain driving sideways across the yard. "Better?" he asked when she came back. "Considerably," she said, and sat down across from him. And that was the beginning of the real conversation. It started, as the best conversations of that kind often do, with the immediate and practical, the calf, the storm, the state of the range after 3 weeks of dry heat suddenly broken by heavy rain. But it moved, the way good conversation moves when 2 people have the right natural rhythm with each other, into larger things. He told her he had come from Texas originally, the Panhandle, and had worked ranches across the territory for the better part of 6 years. He had worked with horses predominantly, had a feeling for them that went beyond the purely technical. She asked him what had brought him to Redemption Creek specifically, and he was quiet for a moment, and then said simply that he had wanted somewhere that looked like it had roots, that was staying, rather than the kind of boomtown that springs up around a mine and then blows away when the vein runs out. She liked that answer. She liked it because it told her something real about how he thought. She told him about the Broken Spur, about her father, about growing up here after her mother died. She did not typically tell strangers about her mother's death, but it came out naturally in the context of what they were saying, and she did not feel the need to pull it back. He listened the way she had noticed him listening to people, with his full attention, and when she finished he said, "It sounds like you know this land the way people know something they chose rather than something they were just handed." She looked at him across the table. "What do you mean by that?" "Some people live somewhere and it is just where they are," he said. "And other people live somewhere and it is actually them, part of how they think. You sound like the second kind." She held that for a moment. "Yes," she said, "that is exactly it." The rain kept them there for another 2 hours talking. By the time it began to ease and the light changed, and Clarence Maddox came in through the back door with mud on his boots and rain on his hat brim, he found his daughter and Paul Hartwell at the kitchen table with empty coffee cups between them, and a conversation that was clearly not finished. Clarence took in the scene. He looked at his daughter's face, which was open and alive in a way he had not seen it in some time, and then he looked at Paul Hartwell, who stood up with a natural courtesy and introduced himself and explained about the calf in the ditch, and the two men shook hands. "Hartwell," Clarence said, "you are working Calloway's place." "Yes, sir," Paul said. "I hope you do not mind my coming in out of the storm." "I mind it not a lick," Clarence said. "Sit down and let me get dry and I will join you." He went upstairs and Augusta looked at Paul Hartwell, who was looking at her with something quiet and considering in his expression. "I think that went well," she said. "He seems like a fair man," Paul said. "He is," she said. "He is the fairest man I know. He is also the most stubborn." Paul's mouth turned at the corner again. "I wonder where you got that from." She felt warmth move through her that had nothing to do with the coffee or the kitchen stove, and she picked up her cup to have something to do with her hands. Clarence came back down, and the three of them talked for another hour. Clarence asking direct questions about Paul's background and experience the way a man who has operated a large ranch for decades naturally does, testing the quality of a person's practical knowledge and steadiness. Paul answered everything clearly and without embellishment, which was, Augusta knew, the right way to handle her father. Clarence could smell an exaggeration at 40 paces, and it offended him more than a straightforward admission of limitation ever would. When Paul finally took his leave, the storm had moved off to the east, and the evening was clean and gold-washed and smelled like wet sage and cool stone. Augusta walked him to the gate, which was normal enough hospitality, and they stood there for a moment while his roan stamped impatiently on the wet ground. "Thank you again," she said, "for the calf." "I was glad to help," he said, and she believed him completely. He put his foot in the stirrup and swung up with a natural ease and settled and looked down at her. "Miss Maddox," he said, and touched his hat. "Mr. Hartwell," she said. She watched him ride down the road until the bend took him from sight, and then she stood there another moment in the wet evening air, and then she went inside. Over the following weeks, she saw him regularly. Redemption Creek was not a large town, and the Calloway spread was not far from the Broken Spur, and the business of both ranches and the general life of the town created regular intersections. He came into the general store. He was at the town meeting about water rights at the creek, and she noticed that he listened carefully and said little but that what he said was worth hearing. She saw him at church on Sundays, where he attended with a lack of self-consciousness that said this was something he did because he meant it rather than because he was trying to be seen. They talked whenever they met. Not always at length. The demands of work and the nature of their respective days did not always allow for length, but there was a quality to even the brief exchanges that she found herself carrying with her afterward, turning over, finding new things in. He had an intelligence that did not announce itself, that was simply present when you talked to him, and a humor that was dry and warm in equal measure, and he asked her questions about things she actually thought about the territory, about the land, about the future of ranching as the railroad came in and changed the economics of everything. He did not ask her these questions as a performance of interest. He asked them because he wanted to know what she thought. This, she realized one evening, sitting on the porch after supper and watching the stars come out over the canyon, was the thing. This was what she had been trying to explain to her father all along, this thing that she had not had the words for when he asked her what she was looking for. She wanted a man who wanted to know what she thought, not what she brought with her, not the land and the cattle and the family name. What she thought, what she saw when she looked at the world. She was not in love with Paul Hartwell yet, she told herself, not precisely, but she was moving steadily in that direction, and she knew it, with the same clarity with which she recognized whether coming off the mountains or a horse going unsound. Her father, meanwhile, had heard from a man he knew in Santa Fe about a rancher named Buckley who was looking for a match for his son, a young man of 25 with good prospects, and a family name Clarence respected. He mentioned this to Augusta one evening over supper with a careful casualness that she recognized as the tone he used when he had thought about something extensively and was trying not to seem like he had. She looked at him. "Father," she said, "I am merely telling you what I heard." "You are more than merely telling me what you heard," she said. "You have written to this man already, or you are about to." Clarence picked up his fork. "A man has to do something," he said, half under his breath. She looked at him for a long moment, this man who had built something extraordinary from nothing and who loved her in the way that was sometimes indistinguishable from being managed, and who genuinely could not see, she thought, the difference between those two things from where he stood. "Give me time," she said. "Please, just a little more time." He looked up at her, and there was something in his eyes that was both calculating and genuinely, helplessly paternal. "What kind of time?" he asked. "Augusta, you are 22. I am not going to be young forever." "Neither am I," she said. "Which is why I am asking you to let me use it the way I need to." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You have a particular person in mind." It was not a question. He was watching her face, and he was, as he always had been, more perceptive than people gave him credit for when it came to his daughter. "I do not know yet," she said honestly. He looked at her for another moment, and then he went back to his supper, and he did not bring up the Buckley family again that evening. But she knew it was not over. The opportunity she had been waiting for, without knowing she was waiting for it, came the following Saturday. The Calloway family was hosting a gathering at their place, which happened every year in late August when the worst of the summer heat was breaking, and the fall work had not yet fully consumed everyone. It was not exactly a dance, but it was not exactly not a dance either. There was music and food and lanterns strung along the porch in the barn, and most of the families within 15 miles came. Augusta wore a dark blue dress that had been her mother's and that she had altered to fit herself, and she braided her hair up with a ribbon of the same blue, and she rode over with her father in the buckboard as the evening light was going amber and long. Paul Hartwell was there. She saw him when they arrived, standing with two of the Calloway hands near the fence, and he saw her at the same moment and lifted his hand in a natural greeting, and she smiled in return, and she watched her father notice this exchange without comment. The evening went the way these evenings went, food and conversation, and the music starting up, and she talked with neighbors and laughed with the Calloway daughters, who were lively and easy company, and she kept being aware of where Paul Hartwell was in the gathering the way you are aware of a lamp in a room, not because you are staring at it, but because it is giving off light. He came and talked to her properly about an hour into the evening, bringing her a cup of cider with a simple naturalness that did not make a production of itself, and they stood near the fence where the lanterns cast warm light over the yard and talked. About the summer, about the horses he had been working with at Calloway's, about a book she had mentioned once that he had since found and read and had opinions about. He had opinions about things, and they were his own, not borrowed from the nearest other opinion he had heard, and she found this, now as every other time, one of the most appealing things about him. The musicians started up a waltz and the yard became a dancing space, and the couples arranged themselves, and there was a natural moment in which the music and the evening and the lamplight and the two of them standing together created something so obvious that even the hard practical territory air seemed to understand what it was. "Would you care to dance?" he asked, simple and direct, looking at her rather than sideways at the dancers or anywhere but her face. "Yes," she said, "just that. Yes." He was a good dancer. Not showy, but good, the way he was good at everything, with a natural sense of timing and a gentleness that made the movement feel easy. She was a good dancer too, and knew it, and dancing with someone whose rhythms matched yours was one of the small, precise pleasures that life in a territory town offered in compensation for its considerable demands. They did not speak much during the dance because the music took up the space, but she was aware of his hand at her back and his hand holding hers and the particular quality of his attention, which remained, as it always did, entirely with her. When the song ended and they stepped apart, she looked up at him, and he was looking back at her with something in his expression that she recognized. She had been waiting to recognize it. It was the thing that none of her father's chosen men had ever had, that quality of seeing her and wanting specifically her and not the shape of what she represented. "Miss Maddox," he said quietly, and in the way he said it there was everything else he had not yet said. She was aware of her father somewhere behind her in the gathering. She did not look. "Paul," she said, and she watched something shift in his face at her use of his given name, a subtle brightness, a careful held stillness. "I would like to call on you," he said, "if you are willing and if your father would permit it." He paused. "I want to do this the right way." There was something that moved through her at that, something warm and certain and deeply peaceful. The feeling of a piece of country resolving itself into a shape you had suspected was there before you saw it clearly. He was not asking her to make a decision. He was asking for the right to be considered. That was the difference, all the difference. "I am willing," she said. "Come and talk to my father. He is right over there." He glanced in the direction she indicated and then looked back at her with that quiet, considered steadiness. "Now," he said, "unless you would like to wait until next week," she said. The corner of his mouth moved. "No," he said. "I would not like to wait until next week." She would remember later the way the lamplight looked that moment, the warm yellow globes along the fence, the sound of other conversations continuing around them, the smell of late summer grass and lantern oil, and the particular sweetness of cider. She would remember it the way you remember the exact texture of a turning point. They crossed the yard together and she found her father talking with Owen Calloway near the barn door, and Clarence looked up when they approached, and his eyes went from his daughter to Paul Hartwell, and back to his daughter with an expression that was not entirely readable. "Mr. Maddox," Paul said, extending his hand. They had met before, of course, but this was a different kind of meeting and all three of them knew it. "I wonder if I might have a word with you." Clarence shook the hand and studied the man holding it with the frank, appraising look that was pure Clarence Maddox, nothing unkind in it, simply a man who believed in looking at things directly. "Owen," Clarence said, without looking away from Paul, "I believe my cup needs refilling." Owen Calloway, who had known Clarence Maddox for 20 years and understood a dismissal framed as a social request, took himself off with a quiet diplomacy. Augusta stayed. She was not going anywhere. Her father glanced at her and seemed to weigh whether to ask her to give them privacy, and then seemed to understand, with the perceptiveness that was one of his best qualities, that this was not a conversation he was going to be having with Paul Hartwell alone. This one included her. "All right," he said, and folded his arms and looked at Paul Hartwell. "Say what you have come to say." Paul said it. He said it straightforwardly and without theater, the way he did everything. He said that he had come to Redemption Creek with the intention of finding a place he could put down roots, that he had savings of his own, and had worked steadily since he was 16, that his work and character at Calloway's could be vouched for by John Calloway himself, and by any number of men he had worked with across the territory over the past several years. He said that he had come to regard Augusta highly, very highly, and that he would like to court her with the genuine intention of a future, but that he would not proceed without her father's knowledge and consent, because he respected both of them, and because this was the right way to go about it. Clarence Maddox listened to all of this without interruption. He had the quality when he was being serious of going very still, and he was very still now. "You are a cowhand," Clarence said when Paul finished. "Not an insult, a fact stated." "I am," Paul said. "I have been a cowhand. I have also managed a full remuda and 200 head of cattle on a spread in Texas, and I have been saving toward land of my own for 3 years. I do not have what you have built," he said plainly. "I am not going to pretend otherwise, but I am not starting from nothing either, and I do not intend to stay still." Clarence was quiet. He looked at his daughter, who was watching him steadily. "Augusta," he said, "what do you want?" And she thought this question was the thing that told her everything she needed to know about the depth of her father's love. He was asking, despite everything, despite all the men he had tried to bring her, despite his own preferences and fears and practical calculations, he was asking. "I want you to give him a chance," she said. "That is what I want." Clarence looked at Paul Hartwell for a long moment. Then he looked at Augusta again. Then he made a sound that was hard to interpret and looked out at the distant darkness beyond the lamplight. "You can come by on Sunday," he said to Paul without looking at him, "for supper." Augusta felt something open up inside her chest. "Thank you, sir," Paul said. Clarence made that sound again, and then he said he needed his coffee and went to find it, and Augusta looked at Paul in the warm light and felt that same quality of deep, peaceful certainty she had felt on the dance floor, only larger now, more settled. "Sunday," she said. "Sunday," he agreed. Paul Hartwell came to Sunday's supper, and then to the following Wednesday's supper as well, and then it became a regular enough occurrence that it was simply part of the week. He and Clarence talked about ranching and water and politics, the questions about land grants in the territory and the ongoing tensions around those questions. And Paul had real and considered things to say about all of it. And Augusta noticed the way her father's manner shifted over those weeks, the way it always shifted when he found a man he could respect, not warmer exactly, because Clarence Maddox did not do warmth quickly, but attentive, engaged. Between Augusta and Paul, things deepened with a steadiness that matched both their natures. They rode together when the demands of both ranches permitted it, out along the canyon rim or east toward the foothills, and the hours they spent on horseback with the landscape opened up around them became some of her favorite hours she had lived. He talked about his childhood in the Panhandle, about his father who had been a good man who worked himself out and left when Paul was 14, and left nothing behind but a good name and the knowledge of what it meant to do a thing honestly. He talked about the years of working ranch to ranch, learning as he went, building the small store of money and knowledge that he intended to eventually turn into something his own. She talked about her mother, which she rarely did with anyone, about the way Eleanor Maddox had been funny and sharp, and had made the house feel like a place where ideas were welcome, and about how the silence her death had left was the particular silence of a space that used to hold a specific and irreplaceable sound. Paul listened and said little, and somehow the listening itself was the right answer. There was a moment, about 6 weeks into the courtship, when they were riding back along the canyon rim in the late afternoon, the sun going down in copper and rose, and the shadows going long and blue across the red stone, when they both stopped simultaneously for no reason either of them could later have articulated, simply stopped and looked at the view and then looked at each other. And he said, "Augusta." And the way he said her name had everything in it that she had been moving toward since the storm and the ditch and the kitchen and the coffee. "Yes," she said quietly. "I think you know how I feel," he said. "I think I do," she said. "I feel the same way." He looked at her for a moment, this man who was honest in everything and who was being honest now, and she felt the full force of it, not a small thing at all, the full weight of being seen and loved for exactly what you were. He leaned across the space between their horses and she leaned toward him and he kissed her, one careful, certain kiss that was warm and quiet and entirely right, and the canyon and the evening light were witnesses to it, and she thought later that she was glad they had been. They rode back to the broken spur in the golden last of the afternoon light, and when she came in through the kitchen door she was aware that her face was different, that whatever was written there was visible, and that her father, sitting at the kitchen table with the newspaper he had ridden into town for, looked up and saw it. He looked at his daughter's face, and then he looked out the window at the darkening yard, and then he looked back at his paper, and he said, very quietly, almost to himself, "Well." There was, however, a complication, and its name was Harlan Briggs. Harlan Briggs owned the general store and had done so for 12 years, and was well liked and well regarded in Redemption Creek, and he had known Clarence Maddox for as long as either of them had been in the territory. He was a widower himself, 51 years old, and had for some time been quietly convinced that a match between himself and Augusta Maddox would be a sensible and satisfying arrangement for everyone involved. He had never pressed the matter in any official way, had never formally presented himself to Clarence as a suitor, but Clarence knew, because Clarence had the kind of relational awareness that his blunt manner sometimes obscured, that Harlan had feelings in that direction. And Clarence liked Harlan. He trusted Harlan. And Harlan was established and stable and known, which in Clarence Maddox's world accounted for a great deal. When it became clear that the regular appearances of Paul Hartwell at the Broken Spur supper table meant something, Harlan Briggs came to see Clarence one afternoon when Augusta was out on the range with the hands. Augusta did not know about this conversation. She found out about it later, much later, from her father, who told her with a kind of rueful honesty that she appreciated. Harlan had sat across from Clarence and had been direct, which was his nature, and had said that he had long thought of Augusta, that he was aware she was being courted by the Calloway man, and that he wanted to make his own interest known before anything was formally settled. Clarence had listened to all of this, and then had said, with an honesty equal to Harlan's own, that his daughter had made her feelings clear, and that he had given Paul Hartwell his conditional approval, and that he did not see a way to withdraw it in good conscience. He told Harlan he was a good man and that he was sorry it worked out this way. Harlan had taken it with a dignity Clarence respected. He had nodded and said that he hoped she would be happy and that he wished the young man well, and he had meant it, because, whatever his personal feelings, he was at heart a decent man. What Augusta did not know, and what her father also told her later, was that Harlan had said one more thing before he left. He had said, "Clarence, you ought to ask yourself whether you are letting this happen because you think it is right or because you have run out of ways to steer her." And Clarence had sat with that for a long time, because it was a fair question. And the honest answer, as Clarence worked through it in the solitary way he worked through hard things, was that it was both. It was right. Paul Hartwell was a good man, a real man, and the way Augusta looked when she talked about him or came back from riding with him was a look Clarence remembered from Alina and himself in the early years, and he was not so carved of stone that he could not recognize it or honor it. But he had also, he admitted to himself, been steering Augusta for years and had consistently misjudged the destination. And perhaps the most useful thing he could do now was to stop steering and pay attention. He had not formally given his blessing yet. He had given provisional approval to a courtship. The blessing was the larger thing, the thing that mattered, and it was sitting in the back of his heart like a stone he had not yet decided what to do with. Paul Hartwell was aware of this distinction. He told Augusta about it on an evening in early October when they were sitting on the Broken Spur's front porch after supper, her father having gone inside, the sky overhead going deep purple and the first chill of autumn in the air. He told her that he was aware that Clarence had not given his full blessing, and that he wanted to have a proper conversation with her father before too much longer. "I know what I want," he said, and he was looking at her with that direct, quiet clarity. "I want to ask you to marry me, Augusta, but I want to do it right. I want your father to know what my intentions are before I ask you, and I want a real answer from him, not just tolerance." She looked at him for a long moment. The purple sky was going darker and the first stars were appearing. There was a frog somewhere down by the creek making its evening sound. "You know what my answer will be," she said. "I do," he said, but I want to hear it properly with everything in order." "Then talk to him," she said. "He respects directness, he always has." "I know," he said. "I am going to." He came the following Saturday, not on the regular supper night but specifically to talk to her father, and he asked to speak with Clarence alone. Augusta gave them the parlor, which was the formal room, the room for important things, and she went to the kitchen and she told herself not to listen. And then she listened anyway because she was herself and not some other more patient person. She heard voices, not words, just the low, steady rhythm of two men talking seriously. Her father's voice, which had that particular register it got when he was being fully present to something. Paul's voice, which was steady and unhurried, and even across every situation she had ever heard him in. It went on for over half an hour, and then she heard her father laugh, which was not a sound she had expected, and it was a real laugh, not a polite one. She went back to the kitchen window and looked out at the yard and folded her hands and waited. The parlor door opened. She heard footsteps in the hall, and then Paul appeared in the kitchen doorway, and his face told her everything before he spoke. He looked like a man who had carried a weight some distance and been surprised to find it lifted. "He wants to talk to you," Paul said. She looked at him. "What did he say?" "He said yes," Paul said, and then quieter, he said he was glad to know me. She had to look away for a moment at the window at the golden afternoon yard because the feeling that went through her was too large for her face to contain comfortably. She went to the parlor. Her father was standing by the window with his back to her, in that posture he had, looking out at the corral fence and the far bluffs, and she came and stood near him. "Father," she said. He turned. He looked at her with those steady eyes that had always seen her clearly, even when she had not wanted to be seen, and she saw in them something that was the distilled product of 22 years of bringing her up alone in a hard country, of all the worry and the love and the stubbornness and the grief. "He is a good man," Clarence said. "I know," she said. "You chose well," he said. "Or you are going to choose well when he asks you." There was a dryness in it that was his version of warmth. "I was going to choose him regardless," she said gently. He made a sound that acknowledged the truth of this. "I know that too," he said. "I think I have known that for a while." She crossed the small space between them and hugged her father, who stood for a moment as though surprised by this, and then put both arms around his daughter and held on. "Your mother would have liked him," he said above her head. "She had a good eye for people, better than mine." Augusta said nothing. She held on for another moment and then stepped back and looked at her father's face. "Thank you," she said, "for asking what I wanted." He nodded once, very slightly, as though this were not a large thing, and she let him have the fiction that it wasn't. Paul asked her formally the following Sunday, at sundown. She had known it was coming. She would have been foolish not to. But there is a difference between knowing a thing is coming and the thing arriving. And the thing arriving had its own weight and quality that knowing did not prepare you for. She was standing at the gate at the edge of the yard, where the view opened up over the canyon, the place she came most evenings when the work was done, because the view from there at sundown was one of the finest things she had ever seen in her life. The canyon going all reds and golds and deep purples, the sky above it in layers of color so rich they seemed improbable, the evening star just appearing in the darkening east. She heard him come up behind her and she turned, and he was there in the last of the day's light with his hat in his hand and that steadiness that was the most essential thing about him, and he looked at her with everything plain in his face. "Augusta Maddox," he said. "Paul Hartwell," she said. He told her that he loved her. He told her that he had come to Redemption Creek looking for something to put down roots for, and had found more than he had known to look for. He told her that she was the most genuinely herself person he had ever met, and that he had spent his whole adult life trying to be real and honest in a country that did not always make that easy, and that being with her felt like being with someone who understood that in a way that went all the way down. She listened to every word. She let it come in fully, the way you let good weather fully arrive, not braced against it but open to it. "Will you marry me?" he said. She looked at him in the sundown light, the man she had chosen, and felt the full settled weight of that choice, everything it was and everything it would be. "Yes," she said, "I will." He put the hat back on his head and reached out and took both her hands in his, and they stood there in the last of the light over the canyon, and the evening star got a little brighter. Her father came out of the house a few minutes later. Whether he had been watching through the wind or had simply timed it by some internal certainty, Augusta never asked, but he came down the porch steps and across the yard to the gate where they were standing, and he looked at them both and read what was on their faces. Paul extended his hand. Clarence Maddox reached out and shook it. He held it for an extra moment, and his grip was firm and real, the handshake of a man who meant what the gesture said. "Welcome," he said to Paul. Simply that. Welcome. And Augusta, standing in the sundown between these two men who were the most important men in her life, felt something complete about the moment, something whole, something she would carry with her for the rest of her days as one of the truest things that had ever happened to her. They married in November, at the small stone church in Redemption Creek on a day that was bright and cold, the sky that particular deep blue that the territory produced in autumn, a blue so clear and intense it looked like the sky had been rinsed clean. Augusta wore a dress that had been made in Santa Fe at a shop she had corresponded with for 2 months, ivory wool with small pearl buttons along the sleeves, and a hem she had embroidered herself with a pattern of sage flowers, which were the flowers she knew. She carried a small bundle of late-season blooms from the Callaway garden and mountain holly leaves, and her hair was braided and pinned with small ivory combs that had belonged to her mother. Paul wore a dark suit that was clearly new and had been recently pressed, and a white shirt and a cravat that someone had helped him with. She suspected Owen Callaway, and he looked, in the blunt, honest assessment she had always given everything, wonderful. Not in a soft or elaborate way. In a solid, real, deeply suited to himself way that was the way she had always seen him. The church held everyone who mattered in Redemption Creek, and a number of people from the ranches and the outlying areas who had made the drive in, and the Reverend Mr. Lyle, who had been presiding over marriages and funerals in Redemption Creek for 16 years, and who had a comforting directness about him, married them in front of all of them. When she walked down the aisle on her father's arm, Clarence Maddox walked straight and deliberate as he always did, and she could feel the subtle tremor in his arm that he would have denied, and which she loved him for. He gave her hand to Paul's hand, and he looked at both of them with something in his face that was wide and honest and difficult for a man of his contained nature to let people see. And then he went to his seat in the front pew. She and Paul said their vows to each other in the simple, clear language of the 1878 ceremony, and the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, and Paul kissed her briefly and warmly, and she felt the warmth of it down to the soles of her boots. The celebration afterward was in the Callaway barn, which was large enough for the whole assembly, with tables of food that half the women in town had contributed, and musicians who played until late, and the kind of communal warmth that these gatherings had, the sense of a whole community marking something together and meaning it. Augusta danced with her father first, which was the tradition, and Clarence held her hand and steered her through a waltz with a seriousness that made her laugh, which made him almost smile. "You are happy," he said. "Yes," she said. "That is what I wanted," he said. "I know," she said. "I know it always was." He nodded once and they finished the dance, and he surrendered her to her husband, which he did with the manner of a man completing a handoff he had been uncertain of and had decided to trust. She danced with Paul for the rest of the evening, or she stood beside him, or she sat with him at the long tables, and through all of it there was the quality she had recognized in him from the beginning, which was that he was entirely present, entirely here, entirely with her, and not some version of her that suited a plan. They stayed that first night at the Broken Spur, in the room that had been the guest room and which her father had quietly prepared with clean linens and a vase of late autumn flowers on the dresser, And in the morning she woke to the gray pre-dawn light and Paul's voice saying her name softly and the smell of coffee. And she lay there for a moment before opening her eyes and let the full reality of her life settle over her like something warm. It was, she thought, as good as anything she had ever known. The Callaway Ranch had, in the months after their wedding, become a kind of point of transition for Paul, who had been talking with John Callaway about the possibility of taking on a larger role than simply a working hand. Callaway respected Paul's judgment and his ability with horses and cattle both, and had been considering for some time whether he needed a foreman on the western section of his land. The conversations went well, and by the following spring, Paul had been offered and accepted the foreman's position with a salary that represented a genuine advancement and the use of a small house on the Callaway property, a two-room house that was solid and had a good stone fireplace, and that Augusta looked at when Paul first showed it to her with the same evaluating eye she turned on everything. "We can make this work," she said. "We can make it better than work," he said. "Yes," she said, "we can." They were settled into the small house by March, and Augusta made it into something that felt like them, with the books on the shelves and the good Mexican blanket on the bed, and her mother's cast iron on the stovetop, and Paul's spare saddle hanging in the lean-to. They converted into a tack room. She still spent time at the Broken Spur, which was a 15-minute ride, and which her father was glad of. She managed the household accounts for the Broken Spur, which Clarence had asked for her help with and which she was good at, and she rode over several times a week and had supper with her father as often as the week allowed. The relationship between Clarence and Paul settled, over the following months, into something that was more than tolerance and approaching something genuine. They had enough in common, enough practicality and respect for the land and the work, and Clarence's approval, once given, was the kind that built rather than diminished. Harlan Briggs, she was glad to find, had taken Paul's presence in the community as well as a man of his quality could be expected to. He was not warm about it initially, but he was correct, and over the months he and Paul found a functional working relationship built on the business dealings between the Callaway Ranch and the general store. And by summer, he was treating Paul Hartwell with the same straightforward regard he gave to most of the men he did business with. Augusta served on the church auxiliary, which met monthly and managed the social welfare concerns of the community, the families hit by illness or accident, or the hard, unpredictable mathematics of territory farming. She was good at the organizing and at the straightforward conversations about need that some of the other women found delicate. She was also good at writing letters, which she did on behalf of several families in the community who needed to correspond with banks or government offices or courts about land and water rights questions. And this work, which was partly practical and partly a form of advocacy, gave her a purpose that had nothing to do with the Broken Spur or the Callaway Ranch, and was entirely her own. She was aware, in these months, of the deeper injustices around her in the territory, and she could not ignore them even when they were inconvenient to think about. She had grown up watching the Apache people displaced from land they had worked and known for generations by policy and violence, and a system that answered only to its own priorities. She had watched families she knew, Mexican families who had been in the territory before her father arrived, lose land claims to newcomers with better lawyers, and a legal system that was only beginning to find its way in this place. She wrote letters about these things too, to the territory's legislative council, to newspapers in Santa Fe and Albuquerque, letters that were signed Augusta Hartwell and that said plainly what she thought needed saying. Paul read these letters before she sent them and said she was right about all of it and that the territory would be better for having people willing to say it. She loved him for that too. The first full year of their marriage was not without its difficulties, as first years rarely are. They were two people with strong natures and clear opinions, and the occasional divergence of those opinions created friction that needed to be navigated. She was direct, and he was steady and sometimes her directness, and his steadiness ran up against each other in ways that required them both to slow down and look at what was actually happening rather than what they each thought was happening. There was an argument in April about a decision he made regarding a horse purchase for the Callaway Remuda that she thought was wrong and told him so at length, and he listened but did not immediately agree, and she found herself frustrated in a way that had an edge of something frightened underneath it. And later that evening, when they had both been quiet for a while, she told him that. "I get frightened sometimes," she said, "when I think a decision is wrong and the person making it does not immediately see it my way." He looked at her with that fullness of attention. "Because you are not certain you will actually be listened to," he said. "Yes," she said, "that is exactly it." "I will always listen to you," he said. "I may not always agree with you, but I will always listen." "I know that," she said. "I know it, and I still get frightened." "Because the world has not always worked that way," he said. "No," she said, "it has not." He reached across and took her hand and held it and said nothing more, and that was the right answer, and she held his hand back and felt the freight of what had just been said settle into something that would make them stronger going forward. The horse he had bought turned out to be excellent. She told him so, and the way he smiled was better for not being smug. By June of that second year, she knew she was pregnant. She had suspected it for 2 weeks before she was certain, and when she was certain she sat with it alone for one morning, just to have it for herself before it became shared, this particular quiet joy of knowing. She told Paul that evening after supper, and his face, the immediate unguarded openness of his face when she told him, was something she put in the permanent collection of her best memories right alongside the sundown at the canyon gate, and the kiss on the ridge, and the look on her father's face when he shook Paul's hand. She told her father the following Sunday. Clarence Maddox sat at his kitchen table and looked at his daughter and then looked down at the table and was quiet for a long moment. "Eleanor always wanted grandchildren," he said, and his voice was not entirely steady. "I know," Augusta said. He looked up and his eyes were bright in a way he would have preferred not to be seen, and she pretended not to see it, which was the right thing to do. "When?" he asked. "January," she said. He nodded and cleared his throat and got up to pour himself coffee he didn't need and stood with his back to her for a moment. "You will need more help in the house," he said. "I will manage," she said. "You will have help," he said, in the tone that meant the conversation on that point was concluded. He sent over his housekeeper, Mrs. Ramos, twice a week, and he came himself on Sundays and sat in the small house's kitchen and talked with Paul about cattle and water, and the coming winter while Augusta sat nearby, and let her father's love fill the room in all the indirect ways it always had. The baby came in January, on a night when the temperature outside dropped to 0, and the stars were so bright they seemed to be pressed against the glass. Paul had ridden to fetch the midwife, Mrs. Colton, who was experienced and capable and calm, and Clarence had sat in the kitchen of the small Callaway house and kept the fire going and looked out the window and prayed. The baby was a boy. He came into the world in the deep cold hours before dawn and announced himself with a voice that made Paul, who had been allowed in at the last, actually laugh out loud with the surprise and joy of it. They named him Edward, after no one in particular, a name they had simply both liked and agreed on in one of the easier agreements of their lives, with the middle name Clarence, which was Paul's idea, and which Augusta told her father about 2 days after the birth when Clarence came to meet his grandson. Clarence held the baby with the awkward, careful deliberateness of a man who has not held a baby in 20 years, and looked at the small face, and said nothing for a long time. "Edward Clarence Hartwell," he said finally. "Yes," Paul said. Clarence looked up at him. Something passed between them in that look, the full accounting of what they were to each other now, what this moment was in the long line of all the moments since Paul had first walked into the Broken Spurs kitchen out of the rain. "Thank you," Clarence said simply. Paul nodded. He was not a man who needed more words than that in a moment that had all the ones that mattered. Augusta, lying in the bed with the particular exhausted clarity that follows childbirth, watched her father hold her son and her husband stand nearby, and felt, not for the first time and not for the last, that her life had been built by her own hands and her own choices, and that the shape it had taken was a shape she was deeply, quietly proud of. The years that followed moved with the particular rhythm of a life that is fully inhabited, busy and full, and sometimes difficult and always real. Edward was a sturdy, curious child who had his grandfather's jaw and his father's steady attention, and his mother's refusal to be told what to do with more than polite firmness, and who grew up between the small house and the broken spur with a natural comfort in both places. By the time he was walking and talking with that particular mix of authority and vocabulary that very young children deploy, Paul had been offered a partnership in a small piece of land adjoining the Callaway property, a parcel that John Callaway was looking to sell to someone he trusted to manage it well. It was 40 acres with a water source and good grass, and a building site on a low rise that had a view of the canyon rim, and Paul had been saving for 3 years with exactly this kind of possibility in mind. He and Augusta sat at the kitchen table with the map spread between them and the lamp turned up and Edward asleep in the next room, and talked it through from every side over the course of one long evening. The money he had was enough for the land and a modest beginning. The house on the rise would have to be built over time. They would need to continue managing carefully. But the land was good and the price was right and the water was real, and these were the fundamentals. "This is what you came here for," she said, looking at the map. "This is part of what I came here for," he said, looking at her. She smiled. "Then let us do it." They named the property the Ridge, which was simple and true, and broke ground on the main house that spring, with help from the Callaway hands and the Broken Spur hands both. One of those cooperative labor days that the territory had always run on. A dozen men who raised a wall frame and ate together at noon from a long table Augusta and Mrs. Ramos set up in the open air. Clarence Maddox was there, working alongside men 30 years his junior, and at noon when they sat down to eat, he looked across the table at his daughter, and then at the frame of the rising house, and then at Paul beside her, and he ate his food with a satisfaction that she could read without words. The house was finished by fall, a good solid house with 3 rooms and a covered porch and a proper kitchen, and the stone fireplace Paul had built himself over 2 weeks with the patient, careful quality he gave to everything that he wanted to last. They moved in on a warm October day, and that evening she stood on the porch with Paul in the last of the light and looked out at the canyon rim in the distance and the grass going golden in the afternoon and the sky with its evening colors coming up. "Is it what you wanted?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment, looking at it all. "It is more than I wanted," he said. "I did not know to want exactly this." He turned and looked at her. "You are more than I knew to want. That is just how it is." She took his hand and they stood there on the porch of their house in the October evening, and the canyon was red and gold, and the sky was going purple, and the first star was appearing. The same evening star she had stood under at the gate on the day he had asked her to be his wife, and everything felt like itself, exactly and completely. The second baby came 2 years after they had moved to the Ridge, on a spring night when the air smelled of new grass, and the canyon below the house was full of the evening sounds of the territory, coyotes and owls and the creek running clear and cold with the snowmelt. The birth was quicker and Augusta was more at ease with it this time, and Paul was there for all of it which she had wanted, and when the baby arrived it was a girl. They named her Alina. Clarence, when he came and held his granddaughter, stood very still for a very long time, and his face was full of something that was private and deep, and that Augusta understood exactly and did not interrupt. "Alina," he said. "Yes," she said. He nodded once, and then he sat down in the chair by the window and held the baby Alina against his chest, and looked out at the spring afternoon with the expression of a man who has been given back something he thought was gone entirely. The Ridge became, over the following years, a proper going ranch of its own. Paul built the herd steadily, with the judgment for cattle he had been developing since his earliest days working ranches in Texas, and with the horse work that was his particular gift, selecting and training animals with a care and skill that built a reputation among the ranchers of the region. Augusta ran the household and the books and the advocacy work she had always done, and the small house became a house that people came to, that children grew in, that had books on the shelves and good food on the table and conversation that mattered. Clarence Maddox retired formally from the active management of the Broken Spur when he was 63, which everyone who knew him recognized as late. He had been slowing for 2 years, the accumulated work of a lifetime making its accounting known in his joints and his wind, and finally he handed the day-to-day of the ranch to Hector, who had earned it 10 times over, and moved more fully into the role of elder advisor and grandfather. He spent more time at the Ridge than at the Broken Spur in his later years, and Augusta thought this was right. The house her father had built with his hands was a monument to his will and his love and his stubbornness. The house on the rise was where his family was. He died in the winter of 1889 in his own bed at the Broken Spur, quietly and without extended suffering, which was what he would have wished if he had been the kind of man to express wishes about such things. Augusta was with him. Paul was there. Edward, who was 11 by then and looked like his grandfather in a way that had always pleased Clarence without his ever saying so directly, was allowed to come and say goodbye, which Augusta judged was the right thing even though it was hard. She mourned her father with the same complete and unsentimental fullness with which she did everything. She missed him every day for the rest of her life. But she had known him, had really known him, and they had had the conversations that mattered, and she carried him with her in every part of herself that was honest and stubborn and rooted in the land she loved, which was most of herself. The Broken Spur passed to her, as it had always been understood that it would. She brought it into the Ridge's operation not by dissolving one into the other, but by managing both as what they were, related but distinct, connected by family and land and common purpose. Hector continued as foreman of the Broken Spur with her full trust and authority, and Paul's management of the Ridge and the relationship between the two properties gave the whole of it a coherence and stability that made it one of the strongest ranching operations in the region. Edward grew up to be a person his parents were deeply proud of, which they told him directly because they were that kind of family. He had his mother's intelligence and his father's steadiness, and he was, by the time he was 17, a working part of the Ridge's operation who had opinions worth hearing, and a gift with the horses that showed he had inherited something specific from his father. He stayed. He wanted to stay, and this was his choice, and his parents recognized the difference between staying because you chose it and staying because you were shaped into it, and they were glad of the choice. Eleanor was 7 years younger than her brother and had, from the earliest age that personality becomes visible, a particular quality of her own that was distinct from both her parents and from her brother, a warmth that was also practical, a way with people that made them feel immediately at ease, and a ferocity about fairness that made Augusta smile with a specific private recognition. She would grow into her own life on her own terms, that was clear, and Augusta intended to make sure that the terms were ones Eleanor herself had chosen. The evenings at the Ridge, in the years that settled into themselves after Clarence's death and the Broken Spur's passage into Augusta's management, had a quality that she recognized as happiness. Real happiness, not the performed contentment of people who have convinced themselves they have what they want, but the solid, unadorned satisfaction of a life that is fully what it is. Paul would come in at the end of the workday and wash up at the basin and sit down at the table she had kept set with the same care since they had first moved in, and they would eat together and talk together, and after supper, if the evening was right, they would sit on the porch and watch the sky go through its colors over the canyon. He still had that quality, after all the years, of being fully present when he was with her, and she was still aware of it the way she had been at the beginning, not with the sharp edge of new attention, but with the settled warmth of something known and precious. She told him once on one of those evenings many years into their life together that she thought about the storm sometimes, the one that had started everything. "If that calf had not gone into the ditch," she said, "I would have found another way," he said, "or you would have." She considered this. "Yes," she said, "I think we would have." She paused. "But I am glad it was a calf in a ditch in a storm. It was very us." He laughed, a real laugh, and she loved the sound of it the way she had always loved the sounds of her life, the particular sounds of it, the ones that meant she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The territory of New Mexico would not achieve statehood until 1912, and neither of them lived to see it, but they lived to see much of the transformation that led toward it, the railroad coming fully through, the legal structures of the territory consolidating, the land and water questions that had consumed so much of the political life of the region slowly and imperfectly working toward resolution. They participated in that process in the ways they could, through the letters Augusta never stopped writing, through the relationships Paul maintained with everyone across the region, through the ordinary daily practice of treating every person on their land, and in their community with the equality they believed was owed. There were arguments and failures and things they got wrong and had to go back and reckon with, because that is what a life is. The hard years when the drought came and the cattle prices dropped, and they ran the accounts very close and slept some nights with the weight of the decision sitting heavy. Those years were real, and they lived through them with the same quality they had brought to the good years, which was an honesty about what was happening and a refusal to let difficulty separate them from each other. In 1895, the year Edward turned 17, John Calloway came to Paul with the offer of the full Calloway property, which Calloway was selling as he and his wife prepared to move to Santa Fe to be near their daughters. Paul was 44 years old and had been saving and building for 17 years of marriage, and he had, in the calculations they did together at the kitchen table that autumn, exactly enough. They sat with it for 3 evenings, going over every side of it, and on the third evening Augusta put down the account book and looked at her husband. "This is what you came here for," she said. The same words she had said over the map of the first 40 acres, and she said them intentionally. He looked at her, and she could see in his face the whole of what they were together, what they had been to each other across all the years, and what they would continue to be. He looked like the man who had reached down from the edge of the ditch in the rain and pulled her up, steady and real and entirely himself. "This is what we built," he said. They bought the Calloway land in the spring of 1896 and combined it with the ridge and the broken spur into a single operation that was one of the most substantial in the territory, the largest ranch in 50 miles, just as the broken spur had been in her father's time, built not by one person's will this time but by 2 people's together. She stood on the porch of the house on the rise the morning after the papers were signed, in the early light of a territory spring day, the kind of morning when the air was cold and clear, and the smell of sage was strong, and the canyon was still, and the world felt entirely awake and entirely itself. Paul came out behind her with 2 cups of coffee and handed her one, and stood beside her looking at the same morning. She thought about her father, and about her mother, and about the girl she had been who had refused every man brought to her door, because she was waiting for something she could not name but would recognize when she found it. She thought about a storm and a ditch and a cup of coffee at a kitchen table and a dance in a lantern-lit yard and a sundown at the canyon gate and the sound of a first baby's voice and the feel of her father's arms and the look on his face when he shook this man's hand. She thought about all of it, the whole length and texture of it, and she held the coffee cup and felt the morning. "What are you thinking?" Paul asked. "That I am exactly where I am supposed to be," she said. He put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and the canyon below them was waking up in the new light, red and gold and full of morning, and the life they had built together spread out around them in every direction as far as she could see. Above them, an early hawk was making wide, slow circles in the brightening air, riding a current that carried it higher and higher with no effort at all, just the outstretching of its wings and the willingness to rise. She watched it until it was only a small dark mark against the blue. She thought, yes, exactly that. The coffee was warm in her hands, and the man she had chosen was beside her, and the land they had built was all around them, and the morning was still and wide and entirely real. And that was everything, and it was enough, and it was more than enough, and it was hers.